as players were starting to wonder, perhaps even worry, when would the next round of balance tuning happen, with most of the answers being perhaps on the 10th of September when the season actually begins, or on the 17th of September after the heroic week, after Blizzard has gathered some of the data of week 1. While those discussions were underway, we actually got a surprise extra bunch of balance tuning that will go live next reset, so in a few days. And some of these changes are quite interesting. They go to touch some of the strongest, some of the best performing specs, and even try to buff some of the weakest. Of course, by the time we are done with this, many players will be complaining about some of the specs who supposedly got away from the nerf bat of Blizzard. However, let's start with who didn't get away, which is Frost Death Knight. Frost gets its Frost Strike, Obliterate, Icy Death Torrent, and Glacial Advance all nerfed. Now, we have been tracking the results of Frost and the results overall, both in single target, which were good, and in AoE, which were very good, especially in Mythic Plus. So it was definitely part of the discussion in being one of the better performing specs. Now, funnily enough, this nerf actually hurts more what was not their best performing spec, in the raid at least. The Breath build of Frost Death Knight was just gotten to be slightly ahead of the normal build of Frost Death Knight, and obviously these nerfs are smaller nerfs to this build because this build does more damage with Breath. So the amount of damage of the abilities you are nerfing, so Obliterate, Icy Death Torrent, that number is going to be smaller than if we take their traditional build, where the damage of Obliterate, the damage of Frost Strike, the damage of Icy Death Torrent is going to be higher. And the same logic goes for their AoE results as well. If you take their standard Deathbringer Mythic Plus build, you take together all of the damage they did with Icy Death Torrent, with Obliterate, with Glacial Advance, it's going to be a larger nerf. However, even this larger term, it's still a small nerf. We're talking about a 2% nerf in the typical no breath build, even less than 1.5% nerf if you're playing breath. In AoE, it's almost at the 3% mark in terms of a nerf. So we're not talking about something major when it comes to the Frost nerfs. Then we have a very surprising change, because finally Balanced Druid is touched. Perhaps, though not in the way we might have wanted, because we start by looking at Star Surge being buffed by 12%. So you're like, great, 12% buff to Star Surge, right? So it's like a 1.7, 1.8% damage increase. That's good. However, what's the problem? You also get Umbral Intensity being nerfed. The Umbral Intensity is the one that buffs by a lot your generators, your Wrath or your Starfire. So the bonus buff of Wrath goes from 50% more damage to 40% more damage. So you're like, hold on a second, this is buffed by 12% more, this is also nerfed by 10%. There isn't really much of a gain then, you know? It's practically a neutral change. Even if we go over to the Balanced Druid Eluna's Chosen version, so instead of playing with Wrath, you're playing with Starfire, Starfire is nerfed by even more, since it was even more powerful and doing even more damage. Instead of being a 50% damage buff, it goes down to 30% damage buff. So again, it's practically a neutral change, and that is what it is. This is simply meant to be a change to shift more power into your spenders rather than into your generators. That's why I said it's a surprising or weird change, because on top of this, which might make your rotation and the logic of your abilities better, you also kind of wanted more damage. You also kind of wanted to be buffed as a Balanced Druid, which is not really happening in this change. What is happening is the buff given to Devastation. We have a neutral change to Firestorm, 20% more damage, but lasts for 20% less. It's the 6% damage buff. That is a good thing for Devastation. Now, Devastation doesn't have a working APL. It's not that we can gauge just how powerful they are or are going to be with this buff, but it is obviously a welcome change, also considering Devastation has to fight against Augmentation, which does look like an uphill battle for the spec right now. Then we have changes to Hunter, to Pack Leader. So Pack Leader is being buffed for both BM and Survival. For BM it's being buffed across the board. For BM it's being buffed not just in the damage of Vicious Hunt, but also in the crit damage of Half of the Pack. For Survival, the crit damage buff given to Half of the Pack is even larger. Also, you get a buff called the Herd for your kill shot damage, and you also get a buff to Furious Assault. In the case of Survival, it's for Raptor Strike. The reason why Survival gets buffed more is because Vicious Hunt for Survival is being nerfed. Damage is decreased for Survival, but buffed for Beast Mastery. The problem for Survival was the further buffs that Vicious Hunt was giving to Kill Command and making you spam Kill Command a little bit too much. So the idea was to try to buff other things in your kit like Kill Shot or like Raptor Strike to not make you spam Kill Command nearly as much. Now, the thing about Pack Leader right now is that it's still far behind in terms of single target damage for Beast Mastery, quite a lot far behind for Survival. What changes a lot though is the AoE situation. Yes, for Survival it's still, a disaster, no matter which profiles we're looking at. If you're looking at 5 targets sustained damage, Pack Leader is almost 30% behind. If you're looking at 8 target burst, Pack Leader is more than 20% behind. If you look at Mythic Plus simulations, Pack Leader is almost 50% behind. So none of these buffs will do anything. For BM though is where it gets, much closer in terms of gaps, because you see the gaps here between Pack Leader and Dark Ranger. This is like 2%, and then 8 targets burst. This is like 2% again. And then you have Mythic Plus simulations, which is like 7%. So it's much closer, meaning that the buffs given to Pack Leader for BM might make it actually more competitive in AoE situations. Not really as much in single target. These are, 2 to 3% damage buffs overall. Vicious Hunt being buffed, here it is, being buffed by 10%, it's only a 0.5% damage buff, plus you getting almost constantly 6% more critical strike damage. If you look at the amount of crit you have as a BM in Best in Slot gear, it's about a 2% damage buff, increasing your critical strike damage by 6%. So it's barely a 2.5 to 3% damage increase for BM. For Survival, it's not even that, in the sense that it's Vicious Hunt, the one that gets nerfed, so it's actually a 1% damage nerf. But even with slightly less crit than a BM, your critical strike damage buff is larger, so it evens out, plus the 2 extra buffs to the talents that you're getting as a Survival Hunter in an attempt to balance them out more against Kill Command. It is still, though, considering how far behind Pack Leader is, it is still too small of a buff for both of these specs, except for maybe the AoE portion, the AoE part of Beast Mastery when it comes to Pack Leader. Now, when it comes to Fire, they get about a 2-ish% damage buff. They're getting Pyroblast buff by 5%. So if you take that 1.5-ish% damage buff plus the extra damage that this will contribute to your Ignite due to the damage of Pyroblast, it's about a 2% damage buff. Obviously, the 30% buff given to Living Bomb at the moment equals 0, because right now Fire Mages are not playing down the line of Lit Fuse and Living Bomb at the moment, so this is still for now amounting to nothing. And also considering the damage of Fire and how badly tuned it was, that this buff is still far too small to make Fire anywhere relevant at the moment. What has created more drama, more stomping the feet, seeding, foaming from the mouth, have been the changes of Sun Fury. Arcane Sun Fury. Because first you have Arcane Phoenix damage dealt reduced by 10% for Arcane. So your Arcane Phoenix is about 6% of your damage. So this is a like 0.6% damage nerf, is whatever. You have Arcane Soul, base duration reduced by 1 second from 3 to 2. So the amount of seconds you have of free casting of Arcane Barrage giving you max charges and a clear casting, it's now 1 GCD less. This is like 0.3, 0.4% of your damage. So for now you're at a 1% damage nerf, which, looking at how Arcane has been performing, it's nothing, right? It is definitely getting away with it, considering your damage right now. Where Arcane Mages have been complaining way more, though, aren't the actual damage nerfs, is this. Its Burden of Power can no longer be double-dipped by spell queuing. Now, if you think this is a deja vu, you would be right, almost back to a month ago, because on the 30th of July, we had this line of changes to Arcane, which included the fix to not make this happen, this exact same thing, happen to Nether Precision. Nether Precision works by spell queuing. This is not some sort of elite, obscure, secret strat that only arcane mages have mastered. This is something that works for everyone, and everyone does every day, even without knowing what it's actually called. Have you ever casted Aim Shot, and while you were waiting for the cast and for the bar to finish, you started spamming multi-shot, so that as soon as Aim Shot was finished, multi-shot immediately cast afterwards? That is called spell queuing, and that is what allows you to consume a buff that is supposed to last for one ability or one spell, consume it twice. Because those two abilities, the one that you are using with a cast time and the one that you are using right after instantly, come off at the same time. And the servers on Blizzard's end will see those two spells as having come off at the same time, and therefore consume whatever buff was going to consume only one ability, consume both of them. That is how it worked for Nether Precision. Blizzard tried to fix it, the mages complained, Blizzard reverted it. So now Nether Precision is back to being able to spell queue. Now Blizzard is removing that opportunity from Burden of Power, which does the exact same thing. The logic is you want to use this when you are at 3 arcane charges and the next arcane blast will put you at 4 at max, or you are already at 4 charges, you are already capping your arcane charges, and when this procs you want to arcane blast into arcane barrage. So both of them will get the bonus of this buff, and arcane barrage will be used with max charges. That's the logic. So you had two different passives wanting you to do the same thing. One was spawning every 6 casts of Arcane Barrage and Arcane Blast. The other was spawning when you procced your clear casting. That, outside lining up your cooldowns, was the entire rotation of Arcane, keeping track of clear casting to be able to double dip Arcane Blast and Arcane Barrage in this buff, and then keep track of the charges of your Spellfire Spheres, so you could then proc Burden of Power and use Arcane Blast and Arcane Barrage next to each other to benefit from this buff. We can go even right now to wago.io in Wikoras, search for, let's say, Burden, and there you go. You find one immediately, Spellfire Spears plus Burden of Power Tracker. It counts your Arcane Barrage and Arcane Blast casts. Once you get to 6, you generate a sphere, and because you have generated a sphere, you gained Burden of Power. And when this is active, you wanted to make sure that you had 3 or 4 already Arcane charges, so you can benefit both of the abilities from this one buff. That was the entire logic behind the rotation of Arcane. And that was what players were complaining about. This is now part of our rotation. It makes us play better, it makes us play smoother, it's more interesting to play, so removing this mechanic is making it more annoying, less satisfying to play as a rotation. The nerf itself is reasonably small, because if this one doesn't double dip anymore, you will only use this to benefit from Arcane Blast, because Arcane Blast does way more of your damage than your Arcane Barrage. So now this Arcane Barrage will be losing the 30% damage buff, which would be 30% of 16%, which is 4.8% damage nerf. However, it's not that all of your Arcane Barrages were buffed by this Burden of Power, right? So actually you look at the casts of Arcane Barrage, 64, you look at the amount of times your Burden of Power was procced, the interval of the times it was active, it's about 2/3 of the time, slightly less than 2/3 of the time your Arcane Barrages were cast, they were buffed by Burden of Power. So it's not a 4.8% nerf, it's closer to a 2.5 to a 3% nerf, and then you add the other two ones right here, it totals out to being a 3 to 3.5% damage nerf. So once you go and look at their current performance being nerfed by 3 to 3.5%, it's still nothing. So the part of the complaint were coming from making the rotation worse by removing this interaction with Burden of Power and with the double dipping, the spell queuing that allowed you to benefit from this buff twice. But if we're talking strictly numbers, this is really just nothing. It's still one of the strongest hero talents in one of the strongest specs right now when it comes to DPS. Retribution gets a treatment very similar to Balanced Druid in the sense that looking at the results, you were expecting some kind of buffs, maybe not in AoE, where the results are, okay. They're not weak by any means, but in single target they were quite poor at the moment. Instead, what they get is a 5% holy damage, so most of the damage being buffed, but their mastery is getting nerfed. And if you look at the best in slot of a Retribution Paladin gear, max gear 639 item level, you can see that they had a lot of haste, of course, but also a lot of mastery as well. And in case you're not aware, the mastery of a Ret Paladin increases your holy damage. So you have this change which increases your holy damage by 5%, and this one that nerfs your mastery values by 10%. So this one will no longer go to be a 55% buff in the raid, 55% more holy damage, down to like 49%. So you lose 6% holy damage buff from your mastery, and you gain like 5% from Blizzard's buffing you. So practically it becomes more and more of a nerf the more mastery you stack on your gear. You have a couple of good changes for Priest. Discipline gets just more atonement healing, quite large buff honestly, outside of the raid, so practically for Mythic Plus. This is good and warranted given that Discipline was one of the worst, least used healers when it comes to Mythic Plus. More relevant also the buff to Void Weaver Shadow Priest Void Blast damage increased by 20%. Shadow Priest, after the multitude of buffs given to Arcane, has practically gotten Void Weaver to fall behind Arcane in many situations. The problem with these sims is that it's mostly just happening in sims at the moment. The problem with Void Weaver is a lot around the entire mechanic practically of Entropic Rift, which is currently missing quite a lot of ticks of damage in real life whenever it has to move. So obviously in a sim enemies will not be moving, it does not have these problems, but in real life when it starts moving around it actually loses out damage. So this buff is still quite warranted for Shadow Priest's Void Weaver hero talent. Then you have nerfs to two of the best performing specs right now, Elemental and Enhancement. In AoE they had two of the better profiles, Dungeon Slice for Mythic Plus sims, they had two of the highest ones. When you go in single target they had two of the best ones as well. The TLDR is that they both get nerfed. Elemental gets nerfed by 6%, but their mastery is buffed. So basically the reverse of Ret. The more mastery you have, the less of a nerf this is. Even if the current build, even if the current Farseer build, we're talking about single target here, even if this build doesn't actually want to go for mastery, if you look at the stats on this character, you will find a lot of haste, good amount of crit, and very, very little mastery. But even if you get towards the 3k plus mastery, this only ends up being some, 3%, even less than 3% of a nerf. So similar to Arcane, 3% nerf for this still puts you at a very good spot when it comes to single target damage. Similar change to Enhancement, they get a 4% damage nerf without any exemptions though, because they don't get their mastery buffed like Elemental. They only get Elemental Blast buffed, except they don't run right now with Elemental Blast. What hurts more though is the Mythic Plus portion, the AoE portion with the nerf to Tempest. This is given to both of them. Tempest now does more damage in AoE, but only on 5 targets. Now it gets diminishing return past 5. The TLDR would be that in AoE sims, for example, when we will update them next reset with the new changes, these numbers will go higher, these numbers will go higher, these numbers will likely go slightly higher, but the numbers in large AoE pools will go down, because now your Tempest that you're using in these large pools to do 9 million DPS and be practically the second, I think, or third best performer in these pools. The problem is that in these pools, your Tempest is a lot of your damage. And now it will have diminishing returns on multiple targets. This perhaps hurts Enhancement slightly more than Elemental, because Elemental still has things like Earthquake to hit way more targets, whereas Enhancement is a bit more target capped, so nerfing Tempest might be hurting more for Enhancement. Also, Enhancement does more damage with Tempest than Elemental does. But overall, it's still a nerf, about 3 to 4% for elemental depending on your mastery, and just 4% to enhancement, and slightly larger in AoE when you start getting towards 8+ targets. The final of the changes, not much to go over that, is an all ability damage buff by 5% to Destro. You know, Destro was doing reasonably okay-ish in mega pools, but when it comes to consistent damage in Mythic Plus, Pseudo Sims was terrible, and then their single target results were one of the lowest as well. So yes, they also needed a buff, and yes, also likely 5% is still too small of a buff to really amount to anything in terms of changes. So overall, still quite good to have received all of these changes, because it wasn't even expected for this reset. Most players were expecting any meaningful changes to come in 2 to 3 weeks. So it's good to see some here. Of course, as mentioned at the beginning, we will still have plenty of people complaining. Why hasn't Assassination Rogue been nerfed? What about the damage of warriors? Wait, what about Havoc Demon Hunter? Why aren't the tanks or the healers being changed, for example? I'm sure we will get a bunch of these kinds of complaints, but for now, these were the specs being changed by Blizzard in the tuning that will go live by next reset. So, for today, on this Saturday, it's now time to leave each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, for everyone who has watched the video, as well as everyone who can support completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, just in time. I was just feeling the parched throat starting to come in and make it hard to speak. We finished just in time.